Some would argue Kevin Smith's 1999 film, Dogma, might be the best argument out there for holding on to your old DVD collection. In this comedy, the Jay and Silent Bob director sets his sights on religion, specifically Catholicism, skewering several of its core beliefs along the way. The plot centers on two angels banished from heaven for a drunken act of insubordination and sentenced to spend eternity in Wisconsin. When a Catholic bishop, played by a foul-mouthed comedian George Carlin, rebrands Christianity to be a bit more friendly, the fallen angels spot a loophole through the dogmatic principle of plenary indulgence. What they don't realize is that exploiting it would overturn God's own decree, proving him fallible and unraveling all of existence in the process. Oblivious to the cosmic stakes, the angels march ahead on a violent quest to return to paradise. Dogma isn't streaming anywhere, which, again, to some, is wild, considering the cast includes Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Chris Rock, and Alan Rickman. A big reason for this film's rights are tangled up in the estate of a convicted sex offender, Harvey Weinstein. But another reason it remains in digital purgatory is that, well, frankly, it's downright offensive to a lot of Christians. The film tries to head off the inevitable backlash with a tongue-in-cheek disclaimer during the opening crawl. It reads, "Though it'll go without saying 10 minutes or so into the proceedings, View Askew would like to state that this film is, from start to finish, a work of comedic fantasy, not to be taken seriously. To insist that any of what follows is incendiary or inflammatory is to miss our intention and pass undue judgment, and passing judgment is reserved for God, and God alone. This goes for you film critics too. Just kidding. So please, before you think of hurting someone over this trifle of a film, remember, even God has a sense of humor. Just look at the platypus. Thank you, and enjoy the show. P.S. We sincerely apologize to all platypus enthusiasts who are offended by that thoughtless comment about the platypi. We at View Askew respect the noble platypus, and it is not our intention to slight these stupid creatures in any way. Thank you again, and enjoy the show. I bring this up for two reasons. First, to remind everyone how amazing Dogma is. And second, because of the conversation in the film between the main character, Bethany, and Rufus, the 13th, previously unnamed apostle. Bethany insists that Jesus didn't have any siblings because Mary was a virgin. To which Rufus, played by Chris Rock, shoots back, "Mary gave birth to Christ without having known a man's touch. That's true. But she did have a husband. And do you really think he'd have stayed married to her all those years if he wasn't getting some? The nature of God and the virgin birth, those are leaps of faith. But to believe a married couple never got down? Well, that's just plain gullibility." And now, this is a history podcast, so it's important to remind you, Dogma is a work of fiction. We have zero historical evidence about the married life of Mary and Joseph. The writers of the Bible largely skip over Jesus' early years. His childhood, adolescence, and most of his personal life remain a mystery. There's barely enough material to guess what those missing years looked like for Jesus or his parents. But you know who we do know a lot about. The second most famous virgin in history, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. She earned that nickname because she famously refused to marry, despite the fact that, as a monarch, her first duty was to secure a line of succession. But after watching the disastrous marriages of her father, Elizabeth learned a few hard lessons about love, politics, and the true meaning of "till death do us part." Given her personal history with the subject, it's easy to see why she avoided the altar. But just because the Virgin Queen never tied the knot doesn't mean that the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn didn't have a love life. In the words of Rufus, believing that assumption is just plain gullibility. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I, episode number 6, the Dogmatic Virgin Queen. Now, if you've been following along with previous episodes, I don't need to remind you why Elizabeth, at just 8 years old, vowed to forego marriage for the rest of her life. But instead of rehashing all of that here, let's turn to a familiar tone from Dogma. In one scene, Rufus debates Cardinal Glick, who boldly declares, "The Catholic Church does not make mistakes." To which Rufus and company fire back with questions about the Church's silence during the slave trade and its refusal to speak out during the Holocaust. The Cardinal finally mutters, "All right, mistakes were made." In Elizabeth's case, those mistakes included the beheading of her mother, the grooming she endured at the hand of her stepfather, and her sister nearly triggering a rebellion so that she could marry a foreign monarch. Elizabeth became queen at 25, already past the typical age most princesses were married off. But even before she took the throne, several factors made marriage a distant prospect. Her father had been far too busy managing his own marital chaos to arrange strong alliances for any of his children. On top of that, questions surrounding Elizabeth's legitimacy had long cast a shadow over her place in the line of succession. For years, she carried too many political question marks to attract serious suitors. But once she secured the throne, all of that changed. Elizabeth suddenly became one of the most eligible women in Europe. Spain's Philip II wasted no time in making his intentions clear, despite the fact that he had previously consummated a marriage with her half-sister. As gross as that would have been to the Queen, far more repulsive to her was the fact that he was Catholic. It's worth noting, though, that Elizabeth had shown signs of romantic interest before. She had been found in her stepfather's arms while living with Catherine Parr. Historian Tracy Borman informs us that Elizabeth was like forbidden fruit to him. He was very much drawn to power. Knowing that she's Henry VIII's daughter and she's under his roof is pretty irresistible for Thomas. For him, it was a game. Elizabeth was asked to leave the household after the scandal broke, with Parr siding with the only man she had had a choice in marrying over her teenage stepdaughter. But Seymour wasn't finished. When Catherine died shortly after childbirth, he reignited his pursuit of the now 15-year-old princess. There may have been some mutual attraction, but the real motive for Seymour was power. At that point, Elizabeth's path to the throne seemed unlikely, but she was her younger brother Edward's favorite sibling, and that made her a valuable asset to anyone trying to influence the boy king. That ambition would cost him dearly. On the night of January 16th, 1549, Seymour broke into the king's bedchambers armed with a weapon. Historian Elizabeth Norton speculates that he hoped to acquire the person of the king, marry Elizabeth, and bring down his brother, who just happened to be the Lord Protector of England. It didn't work. Seymour's bold but reckless plan failed, and he was executed. Elizabeth, still just a teenager, found herself dragged into the investigation and interrogated under threat of torture. Although she didn't crack, the entire ordeal left a lasting impression, further cementing her belief that the institute of marriage itself was dangerous, and that maintaining a spotless reputation was essential to survival. Most importantly, however, was the lesson learned about the importance of protecting her sexual reputation. So, while we have plenty of smoke, there's no clear gun when it comes to what Elizabeth did or didn't do with men around her. What we do have is her cutting final word on the matter of Thomas Seymour. This day died a man of much wit and very little judgment. Rufus, the fictional unnamed apostle left out of the Bible in Dogma, is asked whether he was martyred. His response? That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it would be to say that I was bludgeoned to death by big bleeping rocks. When Elizabeth ascended the throne after the death of Bloody Mary, she found herself similarly bludgeoned, only this time by the relentless question of marriage. A Spanish ambassador lamented, "The more certain I am that everything depends on the husband this woman may take," while a German counterpart confidently declared, "The queen is of an age where she should in reason, and as is woman's way, be eager to marry and be provided for that she wished to remain a maid and never marry is inconceivable." It was simply unheard of for eligible women to choose to remain unmarried, as if she were defying the natural order of things. To outsiders, Elizabeth wasn't just eligible, she was a prize. In addition to the wealth and power she brought to any potential union, she also fit the Renaissance ideals of beauty. According to the Royal Museums of Greenwich, she not only embodied those standards, she elevated them. Pale skin, red gold hair, bright eyes, and a tall, commanding presence made for a striking image. But Elizabeth wasn't just a pretty face. She was brilliant, fluent in 5 languages, and well-versed in the classical literature of her time, particularly religious texts. And yet, her refusal to marry confounded many. The world she ruled was deeply patriarchal. A woman was expected to be guided first by her father, who would choose her husband, and then by that husband, who would assume control over her life, her home, and of course, her dowry. Historians Stephen Greenblatt and John Morrill remind us that society taught that while men were naturally endowed with authority, women were temperamentally, intellectually, and morally unfit to govern. Men saw themselves as rational beings. They saw women as creatures likely to be dominated by impulse and passion. So it's no surprise that few blinked when the anti-Elizabethan theologian John Knox thundered, "God hath revealed to some in this our age that it is more than a monster in nature that a woman should reign and bear empire above man." Elizabeth's refusal to marry and the enormous success of her reign has made her a feminist icon in modern times. But her actual record on that front is more complicated. She didn't challenge the system outright. Instead, she dodged it entirely, famously declaring herself already married to the people of England. She even styled herself not as a queen, but as a king. Greenblatt and Morrill explain that Elizabeth's defenders leaned into both biblical precedent and legal theory. They pointed to figures like Deborah, the prophetess who once judged Israel. Meanwhile, Crown lawyers developed the doctrine of the king's two bodies, one mortal and flawed, the body natural, and one immortal, perfect and political, the body politic. Upon her coronation, these two bodies merged. As Elizabeth herself put it in her Ascension speech, "I am but one body, naturally considered, though by God's permission, a body politic to govern." Her flesh and blood body may have been that of a woman, but her political body, by this logic, was genderless, eternal, and sovereign. That's how she justified her right to rule in a world that believed no woman ever should. She does earn feminist points for proving unequivocally that a woman could rule, and rule better than many of the men who came before or after her. But she wasn't exactly a champion of women's rights. In fact, she sometimes reinforced the very stereotypes used to hold women back. In one famous line, she stated, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too." Historian Ishbel Myerscough suggests that we might think of Elizabeth less as a feminist and more as an individualist. If you live such a bizarre life for so long and you've created this image, I think you become your creation. I think she probably thought she was somehow godlike because she didn't fit into the norms. Still, in one major respect, Elizabeth truly did embody the heart of a feminist thinking, that women are the equals of men. She understood that marriage and motherhood would compromise her power. Even if she named a consort, something her sister Mary had done with Philip, people would have assumed her husband was calling the shots behind the scenes. Family entanglements would have complicated every decision. By remaining single, she ensured her loyalty would never be divided. England alone had her heart, and that was enough. She did, occasionally, flirt with the idea of breaking her childhood vow to remain single, but, as the Smithsonian Magazine notes, she was famously dubbed the Virgin Queen, yet only embraced this chaste persona during the later years of her reign. In her prime, Elizabeth juggled proposals from foreign rulers and ambitious subjects alike, always hedging, never committing, carefully keeping her true intentions hidden. In doing so, She avoided falling under a man's control and keeping the prospect of marriage alive as a powerful diplomatic bargaining chip. She turned down a proposal from the Crown Prince of Sweden with a line that probably left the man's pride permanently bruised. I so well like this state of spinsterhood. As I persuade unto myself, there is not any kind of comparable unto it. She left Philip of Spain dangling for 4 full weeks before it dawned on him that he was being ghosted. She let a 50-year-old earl shower her ladies-in-waiting with 600 pounds worth of jewels, fully aware that he was trying to buy his way into her good graces and possibly her bedchambers. Her favorite tactic for handling unwanted proposals? A move lifted straight from her father's playbook. Henry VIII had a habit of offending monarchs by insisting on meeting their daughters in person before agreeing to an engagement, essentially turning royal matchmaking into a glorified beauty contest. It was a gamble that often backfired, embarrassing entire kingdoms when their princesses were rejected. Elizabeth flipped the script. A female beauty pageant might be offensive to some, but turning the tables, asking royal men to parade themselves before like show ponies? Now that was a power move. Historian Anne Somerset explains, the problem was that few princes would be prepared to present themselves for inspection if there was a good chance that, once Elizabeth had a look, they would be ignominiously packed off home. Such an ordeal would not only expose the rejected admirer to universal ridicule, but would also bring dishonor to his country. Time and again, ambassadors would complain that it was unrealistic to expect a royal man to subject himself to that kind of personal judgment. Some even warned that the male ego was so fragile that the humiliation could lead to war. As Somerset explains, Elizabeth had strategic reasons for avoiding a foreign husband. While a dynastic marriage might have offered some political security, it also risked dragging England into foreign conflicts. Mary Tudor's marriage to Philip of Spain had pulled England into war with France, an entanglement Elizabeth was determined to avoid. Whatever safeguards were incorporated into the marriage treaty, Somerset writes, a union with a foreign prince would almost inevitably result in some loss of national sovereignty. Elizabeth made her stance crystal clear. 6 years into her reign, she told the French that the only thing a husband could offer her was an heir, for she had no intention of handing over control of her army or treasury. But the message never seemed to stick, so she repeated it. Often, to Parliament, she declared, "If I were a milkmaid with a pail on my arm, whereby my private person might be little set by, I would not forsake that poor and single state to marry the greatest monarch." To a German diplomat, she was even more direct. She found that the celibate life was so agreeable and was so accustomed to it, she would rather join a convent or suffer death than be forced into a marriage against her will. Damon and Affleck play the wayward angels in Dogma. In one of the opening scenes, Damon's character sits down with a group of nuns, calmly convincing them to renounce their faith and start enjoying their short time on earth. Affleck walks up, incredulous. "Here's what I don't get about you. you know for a fact that there is a God. You've been in His presence. He's talked to you personally. And yet, I just heard you claim to be an atheist. To which Damon shrugs, I just like to mess with the clergy, man. Keep them on their toes. Somerset tells us that Elizabeth operated with much of the same spirit. She was greedy of marriage proposals, and although she always stopped short of an engagement, she never tired of the mating dance. In other words, Elizabeth just liked keeping her suitors on their toes. The Spanish ambassador believed she was vain, delighting in the idea that the entire world was vying for her hand, and whenever she summoned Parliament to request more funds, the same question surfaced, again and again. Who would succeed her? They insisted she fulfill her duty by providing an heir. After all, both her brother and her sister had died suddenly and childless on the throne. When it became clear she would never marry a foreigner, hope shifted towards an English match. Rumors were everywhere. Elizabeth was undeniably flirtatious and more than happy to be surrounded by handsome men. One tortured conspirator claimed she only promoted courtiers who were young, limber, and skilled in private dancing. Another rumor suggested there was a secret staircase leading from her chambers, built so that favorites could visit her under the cover of darkness. The gossip ranged from vague to scandalously specific, with various men named as the Queen's lovers. But Somerset dismisses all of it. On balance, the evidence points to the overwhelming probability that she died a virgin. In the absence of any efficient methods of contraceptive, it would have bordered on insanity for Elizabeth to run such risks. She was so rarely left unattended that covert meetings with lovers would have been impossible to hide. Still, as with so many public women, Elizabeth couldn't win. For those who believed the rumors, she was slut-shamed. For those who didn't, she was mocked for her celibacy. Virginity in a mature woman, Somerset notes, is nowadays regarded as a dubious asset, and even in Elizabeth's day, it came in for its share of mockery. Shakespeare compared virgins to one of our French withered pears. It looks ill, eats dryly, and folklore warned that spinsters would be paired with apes in hell. In this way, Elizabeth found herself damned if she did, damned if she didn't. Still, there was one man who seemed like he might break the spell. Robert Dudley, a childhood friend of Elizabeth's. He was just 2 months her senior, and they'd grown close while both were held under suspicion for treason due to their family's actions. If you listened to our previous episode, you'll remember Dudley as the jackass who married Mary, Queen of Scots, and then destabilized her realm to the point where she conspired with a lover to have him murdered. Before that disaster, however, he was the odds-on favorite to be the one to steal Elizabeth's virginity. Tall, handsome, and an expert jouster, Dudley had legs for days and the reputation to match. They called him the Gypsy, and historian Charles Knightley claims the Queen was violently attracted to him, and he to her. Day after day, they rode and danced together, whispering in alcoves. The rumors were endless. One old woman from Bretonwood was even jailed after telling her neighbors that my Lord Robert hath given Her Majesty a red petticoat, Elizabethan slang for deflowering. Elizabeth made Dudley master of the horse, giving him charge over her stud farm. But there were a couple of problems. One, Elizabeth vow to never marry, and 2, Robert was already married to Amy Robsart, the daughter of Norfolk Squire. Dudley's wife never appeared at the court, as rumors of a breast illness were well known, resulting in many assuming that the Queen was waiting for her to die so she could marry Dudley. Somerset writes that the Queen's behavior towards Robert was nothing short of immodest. The scandal was enough to torpedo at least one foreign proposal. The Holy Roman Emperor pulled his son out of the running, declaring that he had no intention of marrying into such loose company. Still, there's no solid evidence that Elizabeth and Dudley were anything more than an intense flirtation, two attractive young people who enjoyed the chase. Dudley may have been a plaything for the Queen, a test for abstinence as devotion ideal. But Dudley wasn't just a pretty face. He was power-hungry and possibly dangerous. Tired of waiting for his wife to die naturally of what was likely breast cancer, it appears he may have pushed her down the stairs. Her death was officially ruled an accident, but the court of public opinion never bought it, as the staircase wasn't steep enough to explain her injuries. Many believed she had been killed elsewhere and staged at the foot of the steps to cover it up, while the head of the Queen's stud farms was now technically free to marry Elizabeth. The scandal made that politically impossible. Knightley writes, "To do so might have cost her her throne, yet she would not let him go. I cannot do without my Lord Robert," she told the French ambassador, "for he is like my little dog." A pampered lapdog, no doubt. Though his reputation was tarnished, she kept him close. Somerset notes, his reputation had been irreparably smeared by the mysterious death of his wife. Those who opposed his elevation could now cloak their objections in the guise of outraged decency. A marriage to Dudley might have split the realm, possibly even sparked civil war. Still, Dudley worked overtime in an attempt to make himself more appealing to the court. He even promised the Spanish ambassador that if Elizabeth married him, Catholicism would be restored in England. When that pledge inevitably leaked, he scrambled to reinvent himself as the model Protestant. And it worked. Sort of. He was allowed bedchambers adjacent to the Queen's. He coined the concept of muscular Protestantism at court, exuding idealism and patriotic fervor. Their dance continued for decades. He was given morning access to the Queen's rooms after her ladies had dressed her. He was awarded a business license to export 80,000 undressed cloth. He paid no import taxes. He had a castle. He received a generous pension. If he was a lapdog, he was a lapdog living very well. In Dogma, the two renegade angels set off on a killing spree, believing that once they stepped through the Catholic Church's archway, all their sins would be forgiven, and they'd earn a free pass back into heaven. But Loki, the former angel of death, starts having second thoughts. He interrupts Bartleby and proclaims to the stunned crowd, "You have been judged guilty of sinning against our Almighty God, and I promise you, you shall pay for your trespasses in blood." When Bartleby demands that he reveal his angelic wings, Loki hesitates. "I'm feeling a little exposed here." In 1563, Robert Dudley experienced a similarly vulnerable moment. Only instead of divine wings, he overplayed his political hand. That year, he teamed up with Elizabeth's Secretary of State to pressure Parliament into once again forcing the issue of the Queen's marriage. Dudley, ever the egoist, assumed this bold move would result in his long-awaited elevation to royal husband. Instead, it left him dangerously exposed. If there was one thing that Elizabeth dreaded more than anything, it was Parliament's meddling in her marital status. Historian Geoffrey Elton believes that as punishment for Dudley's arrogance, Elizabeth turned around and suggested something brutal, that Mary, Queen of Scots, should marry him instead. It was a classic kill two birds with one stone strategy. Elizabeth had already decided she'd never marry Dudley, especially after the rumors surrounding his wife's suspicious death. But she also knew he wasn't going to stop pestering her until she became someone's royal husband. Mary, on the other hand, was eligible and eager. There were whispers that she was aiming to snare a high-ranked Catholic suitor from the continent, which posed a major threat. Though Scotland was nominally Protestant, a powerful Catholic alliance could reverse that, and, geographically, Scotland was the easiest point of invasion into England. Keeping Mary tied to Protestantism was critical. Dudley, since his awkward flirtation with the Catholic Restoration, had reinvented himself as a model Protestant. Even better, Elizabeth knew she could control him and use him to manipulate her Scottish cousin. But not everyone was buying it. One of her subjects quipped, Elizabeth should marry Lord Robert first, and then, when it should please God to call her to himself, she could leave the Queen of Scots heiress both to her kingdom and her king. Still, Elizabeth spent time trying to make it happen, and in the process, she became increasingly obsessed with Mary's appearance, temperament, and power, setting the stage for one of the most iconic rivalries in royal history, still fueling Hollywood screenplays today. Ultimately, it was Dudley himself who blew up the plan. Rather than go to Scotland, he suggested sending Elizabeth's cousin, Henry Lord Darnley, in his place to negotiate. He knew full well that Mary, desperate to wed, wouldn't be able to resist Darnley's boyish good looks. He was absolutely right. Mary fell head over heels. Elizabeth, scrambling to stall the union, forbade the Queen of Scots from marrying her subject and withdrew her blessing. Somerset writes, Elizabeth assumed that Mary would not dare marry Darnley without her authorization, and envisioned that there would be another round of protracted negotiation before anything could be decided either way. The goal was to use this as leverage. Elizabeth hoped Mary would publicly renounce her very strong blood claim to the English throne in exchange for Elizabeth's approval. Then, fate intervened. Darnley nearly died from a bout of measles. Mary, emotionally overwhelmed, decided to marry him, with or without her cousin's permission. The relationship escalated so quickly that some of Mary's own countrymen speculated she had been bewitched. As a staunch Catholic, Darnley outright rejected Elizabeth's demand to return to England. The Queen, furious, threw his mother into the Tower of London, but Darnley still wouldn't budge. He married Mary in Scotland, and within days was declared the Catholic King of Protestant Scotland. We covered the fallout of their miserable marriage in our last episode, but To recap, Darnley turned out to be such an insufferable ass that Mary arranged for his assassination. Her reward? Being kidnapped by the assassin, sexually assaulted, and forced into marriage with him. That disaster triggered a national rebellion. Mary was forced to flee her own kingdom and placed herself in Elizabeth's hands. She would never see Scotland again. Despite being part stoner comedy, Dogma occasionally offered real insight into the human condition. At one point, the former angel of death asks the main character, Bethany, "Do you know what makes a human being decent?" His answer? Fear. He elaborates, "And therein lies the problem. None of you has anything left to fear anymore. You rest comfortably in seats of inscrutable power, hiding behind your false idol, far from judgment, shrouded in secrecy, even from one another." Bethany, taken aback, asks whether having beliefs is a bad thing. The 13th apostle replies, "I think it's better to have ideas. You can change an idea. Changing a belief is trickier." At the age of 8, Elizabeth I formed a belief that marriage wasn't for her, and just a decade into her reign, she realized that she still lacked the power to make her own decisions. She told her council of this belief over and over, but they refused to listen. They expected her to change. She had considered it. Once. Perhaps a husband. Perhaps even just a lover. But Thomas Seymour had lost his head, and Robert Dudley had proven himself unacceptable in the eyes of both Parliament and the people. In rejecting love for love's sake, Elizabeth consigned herself to an endless parade of marriage proposals from the courts of Europe and from her own increasingly frustrated Parliament. Catherine de' Medici offered up one of her French sons. Elizabeth tried to duck the proposal, claiming she was too old. The French court didn't buy it. In 1565, under the mounting pressure, she broke down, sobbing before her closest advisors that all those who pressured her to marry were in reality seeking her ruin. When the Holy Roman Emperor's son agreed to visit, Elizabeth inserted a fatal stipulation. He must convert to Protestantism, a poison pill clear to anyone who understood courtly politics. She told others that the heir of Ireland was too poor to marry. Dudley, ever patient, remained in the wings, faithful, friend-zoned, and forever waiting. Eventually, Parliament revolted. She was cornered and browbeaten into agreeing to marry for the good of the nation. But she added one clever phrase, "as soon as it was convenient." That gave her all the room she needed to stall. She picked apart every suitor that came before her, found some flaw, some reason to delay, and in 1567, she dismissed Parliament entirely, scolding them as she did so. Historian Anne Somerset writes, "It would be some years before she had to face Parliament again, and next time, a more malleable bunch of men might be elected." She was already running down the clock. In the years that followed, the issue of marriage faded, not because it mattered less, but because greater threats loomed. Spain, rebellion, espionage, Parliament's fixation on finding the Queen a husband was never really about love. It was about their discomfort with a woman ruling alone. They feared civil war, a succession crisis, a power vacuum. She feared something more personal, that identifying an heir, giving anyone a clear path to the throne, would encourage her enemies to depose her, just as they had done to her mother, just as they might do to her. And then, when the war with Spain finally came, the English people learned something that Parliament had never believed: that war is not exclusively a masculine art. Elizabeth never married. That was her choice, not the state's, not Parliament's, hers. Still, some insist that she made that choice at the cost of her personal happiness. And maybe she did. The most compelling piece of evidence? A small box found beside her bed after her death. Inside, carefully preserved, was a letter written to her by Robert Dudley, dating 6 days before his own death. 15 years later, she still kept it close. A memory of a time when, maybe, she was still open to the idea of giving love a chance. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you'd like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.